Hello and welcome to Macroeconomics. Today we're going to begin our discussion of money and the creation of money. In the next session we'll talk a little bit about the U.S. Version of this, which is the Federal Reserve, and we'll mention that a little bit today, but mostly we're talking in a little more generic terms or a little bit more international in nature. Of course, we're all interested in money and what does money mean to us in getting more money, so let's begin our discussion. First, one of the things that we need to clear up is a terminology that is oftentimes interchangeably used. There is a distinction between stocks and flows. Stocks are just an amount. It's an amount such as there are 200 of these or there are 400 of these. On the other hand, flow is measured as an amount per unit of time. Why does this matter? Well, money is a stock, that is, you have $500 or you have $1,000, but income is a flow, that is, you make $500 per day or you make $1,000 per day. People oftentimes confuse those two or use them interchangeably. A good example of that would be that if you talk about someone being rich, you oftentimes get confused as to whether you mean they own a lot of assets, which is a stock definition of rich, or they make a lot of money, which is a flow definition of rich. And you get different answers depending on whether you use a stock or a flow concept as to what being wealthy is. Money in our context is whatever's generally accepted for exchange. Now, in various different economies, a lot of different things have been used as exchange mediums. There have been a number of commodities. Seashells have been used, stones have been used. There's some great articles about how in prisons cigarettes are used as exchange. There's been a lot of different commodities that have been used. In our society today, we have what is known as a fiat money, which means it has no intrinsic value. It's money because the government says it's money. There's another way of saying that. It's also known as legal tender, which means that it's money because the government says it's money. It's been defined as money. So why do we use money anyway? Well, we use money because in a barter economy, it takes a double coincidence of wants. In order for an exchange to take place, there has to be two people to the exchange, two parties to the exchange. Both parties to the exchange have to want what the other party has. Now, in agrarian economies, that's not a particularly hard problem. So you might have someone who has a number of dairy cows and they have milk, and you have someone else who grows wheat and they have flour. And so the two of them naturally will exchange with one another, the wheat for the flour and the flour for the wheat. And both of them, in that case, you have a double coincidence of wants. The dairy farmer wants the wheat and the wheat farmer wants the milk. And that is the case in a very agrarian type society. It doesn't work so well once we have specialization in the society. Once we have specialization in the society, the producers don't produce the entire product. So you might find yourself needing a haircut, and suppose your job is to create a piece of software. Unless the barber just happens to need the piece of software that you are creating, then it's not going to work out very well. What money does is allows for the breaking up of that transaction. So it's a go-between, it's an intermediary. You exchange for money, you exchange your services for money, and then you take the money and exchange it for the goods you need. And so we don't need this double coincidence of wants. In a monetary economy, we can actually exchange for the money, so the money is the financial intermediary between the two. Now, there are basically three primary functions of money, and we're going to talk about each one of them individually. First, and most importantly, it's a medium of exchange. Now, that's what we've just been discussing. It's a way of making payment for goods and services, for making sure that other individuals will allow you to purchase for them, and that you have something that's useful for that. And that's the most basic function of money. Ironically, when prices start going up too quickly, it fails on that criteria alone. It tends to lose its value, and so as a result, it's not useful. And as I've said, originally, most of our money actually had some intrinsic value, and it was a commodity that starts off as being something more basic, such as cattle or wheat or something of that sort. But in economies, it eventually goes to gold or silver or some other precious metal. The second function is as a measure of value. It's a yardstick that we can use, a common denominator, which allows us to compare disparate goods. It is true that if it serves this function, you actually can compare apples and oranges, because you can compare the price of apples with the price of oranges. So you can compare goods that are very, very different. You can compare houses with cars, and you can compare cars with trucks, and so forth and so on. So it is a standard of measurement that we can use. It's also, if it's a good money, it can serve as a store of value. It allows you to store up or stash back some value, some future purchasing power, some current purchasing power, and carry it into the future. Now, obviously, as time goes on, if there's an inflation, it doesn't serve that purpose very well, and that's precisely why you see most people don't keep a lot of money as a savings sort of measure, is because it loses its value through time. As its purchasing power reduces, it actually is worth less and less. Well, what about our money? Well, the US dollar is not backed by any gold or silver or anything of that sort. If you look at your bill, you'll see that it actually says it's a Federal Reserve note, which means that it's basically a non-interest bearing loan in some sense. It takes its value from the fact that other people accept it. Other people will allow you to trade for it because it is a fiat money or because it's legal tender, and as such it has a value. Now, one important thing for us to understand is how we can measure that. We're going to find later that we really need a methodology of measuring that. And there are basically two good measures of the amount of money that's available in circulation. The first is known as M1, and it's currency, which is both the folding money and the coins, plus checking accounts or checkable deposits. These are sometimes referred to as demand deposits. Means the same thing. It's just something that you can write a check on. Now, that is a very liquid form. Liquidity means that you can immediately use it, that it's available for purchasing goods and services. But there are some other things which are not quite so easily available. That is, you have to do a little something before you can use them, and those are known as near monies. And those are included in M2. So what's included? In M1 you have demand deposits. Negotiable order of withdrawals are for savings and loan accounts. It's basically the same thing as a demand deposit. Traveler's checks, automatic transfer service accounts, those are those prepaid cards, that sort of thing. All of those hold one thing in common. They're the measure of liquidity. They're the ultimate in liquidity because you can use them right now. You can buy things with any of those today without any changes whatsoever. M2 is a little broader measure. It includes some things that are not as liquid, some things that you might have to expend a little energy in order to get at. So it's everything in M1 plus money market accounts. These are accounts with investment bankers or that sort of entities. It's also money market mutual funds and savings accounts. In this case, it's referred to as small savings deposits, which means that they're under $100,000. So note that all of these, you can use them, but you're probably first going to have to transfer the money into a checking account or something of that sort. Now, there actually are some additional definitions. There's M3, which includes everything in M2 plus CDs and larger savings deposits and that sort of thing. And then there's one called L, which includes even more than that. But notice as we move from M1 to M2 to M3, what we're doing essentially is defining a wider and wider group of assets as being money, or the better way of saying that, the finance way of saying that is we're reducing the liquidity. Now, if you look at what's happened in our economy, these numbers are a little bit old, but the NARA definition, M1, includes all of these assets, and you see that it's roughly $1.1 trillion. But as you widen that out, as you include some more illiquid assets, such as savings deposits and money market mutual funds and so forth, that number goes up to about 4.5 billion. That's precisely why it is that we want to have that definition as well, because all of these funds are available on a fairly short-term basis to affect the macroeconomy. And so we want to be cognizant of what's in M1 is obviously very important, but what's in M2 is important as well. Now, money is actually created in our economy through the banking system. And our banking system is known as a fractional reserve system, which means that the banks are only required to keep a fraction of what you deposit on deposit. Now, they do that because they realize that you're not going to show up and want all of your money back at any moment in time, and so they only have to keep a fractional part. Banks are known as financial intermediaries, which means that they take the money that you deposit with them and then they turn around and loan it out. So they're the intermediate between you and the person who borrows that. So they put together all of the many different deposits that various different people, a few cents from here, a few dollars from there, and so forth. They put all that together and then they loan it out to somebody else. Now they do that for two reasons. One is that way they can pay you interest on the money that you've deposited with them. But secondarily, and more importantly to them, is that allows them to make a profit on that money. So they're a financial intermediary. Now, what that means is at any moment in time, they only have a fraction of the money that you've given to them that's available for you to take. And another way of looking at that, and in this country we've had a number of bank panics, as they used to be called, or bank failures, and it typically happens because all of the depositors show up at one time and say, I want my money back. Well, a bank really can't give you all of your money back because they've loaned out some of your money. That's kind of the deal that you make when you give it to them, is that they're going to turn around and loan it out to somebody and then they'll pay you interest on it. And so this is referred to as a fractional reserve system. It is the case that there's no bank that can pay back all of their depositors at one time. They're not set up to do that. That's just not possible. If you want that sort of a system, you need to put it in cash and keep it under your mattress. The result of that is that banks actually create money. They take the money that you give them, they create loans from that, and that becomes money to someone else. That becomes demand deposits or whatever, cash or whatever, to someone else. And so the way economists refer to this is they monetize a debt. They take the debt that comes with that loan and turn it into money. Now, there are limits to how much this they can do. And that limit is set by the Federal Reserve System, and it's referred to as the required reserves ratio. It is the fraction that they're allowed to go down to. So while they can only keep a fraction by law, that fraction is set by the Federal Reserve System. It is the legal minimum of reserves that they have to keep in place, just on the outside chance you might come back looking for your money. And it's referred to, the actual dollar amount is referred to as the required reserves. So if the required reserves ratio is 10% and you have deposited $100,000, then the bank is actually required to maintain $10,000 of that available for your use should you show back up today. Now, what qualifies as a reserve? Well, there are two things that qualify as reserve. That is cash within the bank and deposits with the Federal Reserve System. Cash within the bank and deposits with the Federal Reserve System. Now, cash within the bank may make sense to you. If you show up and you want your money back, then obviously what you want is your money back. You want actual cash. Why deposits with the Federal Reserve System? Well, the Federal Reserve System is actually the people who distribute the money from the Department of the Mint. The Department of the Mint actually prints the bills and makes the coins, but the Federal Reserve System is the distribution agent, for lack of better terminology. So if the bank has deposits with the Federal Reserve and they have need for that money, they can immediately make it available to them in cash. So it's, in a sense, they have the cash stacked up over at the Federal Reserve System if it's on deposit with them. Both of those two numbers can be counted as your reserves. So in our earlier example, and we'll do another one in a second, if you've deposited $100,000 with them and they're required to keep $10,000, that could mean $3,000 or $4,000 in their vault and the other $7,000 on deposit with the Federal Reserve. In the case of, in case you came back wanting all of that $10,000, they could immediately get it from the Federal Reserve if they needed to. So their total reserves may be larger than what's required. In other words, they may have bigger deposits with the Federal Reserve than what's required. Especially if it were the case that you had just made the deposit, you deposited $100,000, suppose you deposited $100,000 in cash with them, then they would only need to maintain $10,000, so they would have excess reserves, money over and above their legal requirement of $90,000. Those are eligible to be loaned. So if you carried in $100,000 and they're required to keep $10,000, they could take the other $90,000 and loan them to someone else. What the bank manager would like to do is to eliminate that last number out there in that equation. In other words, they would like to have total reserves be equal to their required reserves. Because if that were the case, as the slide says, they would be loaned up, which means all of the money is at work. All of the money is out there earning profits somewhere. That's frequently not going to be the case, but that is, that's what the manager is shooting for. They don't want to have any money that's sitting around that's not earning any interest anywhere. So the required reserves is the legal minimum, the excess is all of those above that, and the total reserves is the combination of the two. Now, they could take those excess reserves and they could make loans with them, or they could make loans to the federal government. And loans to the federal government are referred to as government securities. And in fact, banks do both. They loan a certain amount of money out to the local community to buy cars, buy new washing machines, buy houses, whatever. But they also loan money to the federal government. One of the reasons they loan money to the federal government is they can get that back a little more quickly. If they loan you money to buy a house on a 30-year mortgage, they're not going to get that back for 30 years. However, if they buy government securities, if you were to come in and say, I want my money back, they could turn around and sell those government securities and get their money back fairly quickly. So banks in general will have two different sorts of investments. They'll have investments in loans to private individuals or to businesses, but they'll also have a certain amount in government securities as well. What sorts of government securities? Well, they fall into three categories. They're known as bills, notes, and bonds. And really the difference in a bill, a note, and a bond is the length of time that the money's loaned for. Bills can run anywhere from 1 month up to 6 months. Notes run from 6 months to 2 years. And if you loan it to them for longer than 2 years, then it's known as a bond. It's just a debt instrument of the federal government. They do pay interest. They are said to be risk-free. And the most important attraction is the third one down there, they're highly liquid. Highly liquid means that if you decide you need the money out of them, you can resell them in a market. There is a ready market where these are bought and sold on a continuous basis. So if you need the money today as a bank manager, you can immediately turn around and sell it. Now, obviously, you won't get as much interest, and you at least stand the potential of losing a little money. And obviously, the interest rate on these is not as high as it would be on loans. So their preference would be to loan it all out, but it's not in their best interest to loan it all out, because when they make loans, those are highly illiquid. So what happens when you make a deposit is it's actually multiplied or increases the checking accounts throughout the entire chain of banking. And this money creation process is exactly the same as the one we saw on the fiscal side when we were talking about total expenditures. In fact, the number is exactly the same. The multiplier is actually 1 divided by the required reserves ratio, because your extra, in the case that we were talking about, when you deposit $100,000, they maintain $10,000, but they can make a loan of $90,000. That goes to someone else. They make a deposit with it. They'll take $9,000 out of that, and it's the same process that we had on the other side of the house. So the deposit multiplier is equal to 1 divided by the required reserves ratio. In our example, it went from 90 to 89 to 81 and so forth, and it gets smaller and smaller. So it's exactly the same process that we saw when we were talking about total expenditures. The maximum amount is that multiplier times the original amount. Now, let's think for a second about starting a bank. One of the things about banking in this country, we've had such a long experience of having failed banks early on, we're talking revolutionary time, that entire process is controlled in this country by basically 2 entities. In this country, if you want to open a bank, you can't just go downtown and rent an office space and open a bank. You have to have a charter to do so. In this country, we refer to it as a dual banking system, which means there are 2 different types of charters. There are state charters and there are national charters. The charters come from the legislature. So if you decide you want to open a bank in your local community, then you have a little homework to do. First thing off is you've actually got to come up with what in other businesses would be referred to as a business plan. You've got to be able to prove that you have the financial wherewithal, that you've got the management experience, that you have adequate facilities. More importantly, you've got to be able to prove that there actually is a need for the bank that you're intending to start. It's very similar to what happens when you get a license to broadcast. You have to prove that the community that you're going into has unmet need in terms of banking services. That process usually takes 2 or 3 years to do, and you have to convince the people who are going to regulate you that there is a need there and that you're capable of filling that need. If they agree to that, then they'll carry it to the legislature. If you're going to incorporate a bank in the state of Georgia, as an example, they would carry it to the state legislature. And the state legislature, if they agreed, would actually give you a charter, and you would be a state chartered bank. You could alternatively do that at the national level, in which case the U.S. Congress would give you a national charter, and thus you see banks that have national in their name. They're very proud of the fact that they're nationally chartered banks. Now, for years and years, there was a good distinction between the state and the national banks, and primarily because the state regulators were a bit more lenient than the national ones were. And a good example of that's required reserves ratios. The states oftentimes would have lower required reserves ratios than would the national banks. So while the nationals might be requiring 10%, the states would only require 8%. And that varied state to state, and a number of other requirements varied state to state. Result of that was very good banks that were very aggressive began to turn in their national charters and get state charters. You could turn in, if you had a long history of being a successful bank, you could go to the state legislature and say, well, obviously we know what we're doing. And most states would award you a charter, which of course would immediately make you a much more profitable bank. This became a bit of a problem because so many banks were turning in their charters that ultimately and it's not really a loophole, but that loophole was somewhat closed. In 1980, the Federal Reserve received the right to regulate all banks. So now they're not a set of regulations just for states or by individual states and another set of regulations for national. They're all regulated by the same people and they all have the same requirements. And so today, the distinction between a state and a national bank is not nearly as big as it used to be. Once you've done that, however, you're ready to open, and the first thing you have to do is to get a number of investors. So suppose you get a group of investors, they invest $500,000, and for that we'll give them stock or stockholders' equity or net equity. You would then have to turn around and buy stock in the Federal Reserve System. So at least to begin with, this is what the balance sheet for this bank would look like. They would have furniture, building, and so forth for $450,000, stock in the district bank of $50,000, and the stockholders' equity or net worth would be $500,000. Suppose then along comes someone and makes a $1 million deposit, one of the investors most likely, and they bring you $1 million in cash, which means you now have $1 million in total reserves available to you. And suppose that we're going to stick with the 10% that I've been using, suppose that your required reserves ratio is 10%. What that means now is you've got $1 million in total reserves, your requirement is $100,000, so you have $900,000 in excess reserves. Now, as a bank manager, you want to immediately put that to work somewhere. You want to immediately start drawing interest on that some way or other. And so you could create a $900,000 loan to someone, and that would then give them something to begin their business with. We'll skip right on through this. Because it's basically what we just said. Now, you could instead buy government bonds with that, which would be an interest-bearing account, but since you're just beginning work, one of the first things you want to do is to make some loans because you have promised that you would meet this unmet need in the community. When you do that, that $900,000 could be simply a loan which becomes a checking account deposit. Okay, so it is entirely possible that we could take this $900,000 and put it over here, and if we did, then we would have already created money. If instead we actually give the money to the individual, they're going to take it somewhere else and deposit it in another bank. If they deposit it in another bank, then this whole process would start again, wouldn't it? Because that firm, that bank, would then have $900,000 in excess reserves. They would take $90,000 out to hold in reserve, and they would have $810,000 to be used for loans of their own. So this bank has actually created money, and I want to once again use the terminology I used a second ago, and that is they have monetized a debt. They have turned a debt into money. And so in this case, they have turned $900,000 from a loan into money because it's either deposited with them or it's deposited with someone else. And the result of that is the money supply is now larger than it was before. If this process keeps on, and notice this also tells us exactly how things are going to go with the money multiplier, doesn't it? Because it went from it would go from $900,000 to another bank, then it would be $810,000, and that process would keep on until the original amount was done away with. If you keep on doing that process, you actually get the multiplier, and the result of that is you've created the maximum amount of money that's available. So the money multiplier is the change in the total reserves divided by the required reserves ratio divided into 1, and that would give you the total change in deposits. In our case, we started out with $1 million. The multiplier is 10, so this one deposit could give rise to $10 million in change to M1. Because remember, these deposits are checking account deposits, so they'll show up in M1. We want to stop there this time because we've kind of got to a point where we need to know a little bit more about what the system in our country is like. And I'll remind you again that our country is slightly different from other countries in terms of how it handles things. In the next session, we'll talk a little bit about what's the structure of the Federal Reserve System and the people who regulate this whole process, because as you can see, it has some potential dangers as well. That's all for this time, and we'll see you next time.